My name is Eric Ostomchuk. I'm with Traffic Planning and Design, also the Vice Chairman of the DCTMA Board. Again, thank you for joining us for the 1:30 p.m. session, Act 209, Transportation Impact Fee Ordinances and Challenges. We'll have two presenters this afternoon, and I think then we're going to surely try to really focus on any questions that may come up, and I know Joe Mastronaro from Pannoni is going to be running that type of roundtable discussion afterwards. Our first presenter will be Gerald Baker, Senior Project Manager with Traffic Planning and Design. Jerry serves as our project manager for TPD and has completed numerous parking studies, trip generation studies, time delay studies, traffic impact fee studies, and traffic impact studies. He currently serves as the Township Traffic Engineer for several municipalities. His responsibilities as Township Traffic Engineer include the review of plan sets for internal circulation and pedestrian safety, review of traffic impact studies, and other traffic-related investigations as required for the municipalities. Excuse me. Our second presenter will be Nicole Kline-Elsier, PTOE. She's the Regional Service Leader for Traffic at McMahon, a Bowman company. So there's a reiteration here. The Bowman Company, whereas she has been involved in transportation engineering for over 20 years since her graduation from the Pennsylvania State University in 2002, relying on her professional focus areas, which include traffic operations, analysis, simulation modeling, crash prediction, multimodal planning, and public involvement. She has managed successful projects that include transportation impact fee studies. Nicole has experience working with a variety of stakeholder groups, conducting workshop meetings and presenting to the public, and providing expert witness testimony in conditional use and land development hearings at the municipal and county levels. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jerry up to discuss one of my favorite subjects, Act 209 and the impact fees.
Thanks, Eric. One other thing I wanted to add, I've been a lifelong resident of Delaware County, so just wanted to say I'm familiar with the traffic issues in the county. So for today, I just put together a little agenda here. I want to talk briefly about the impact fee legislation, just so everybody, we can set the stage here so we all know what we're talking about. And then an overview of the process, how we actually implement the fees. And then I have an example study that we prepared for West Whiteland Township in 2015. I figured it might be best just to go through that, and then maybe some of the issues that come up will be more apparent when you see how the study is conducted. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges with the current legislation that we often encounter with conducting these types of impact fees. And then, of course, any questions, we can address those. So the MPC actually authorizes municipalities to collect impact fees for off-site road improvements. It's spelled out in sections 501 through 506 of the MPC. And more specifically, section 503A here basically says that a municipality can't, they can't charge for the cost of construction, dedication payment, any off-site improvements, or anything of that sort, unless they follow this act. And it's very specific on how you have to go through the process. And that's what I'm going to get into more detail on. Of course, there's nothing stopping the municipalities from charging for on-site improvements, as needed by ordinance. Often ordinances will require additional right-of-way or widening along a frontage or turn lanes into a site. That sort of thing's not really included in Act 209. It's more the off-site improvements that we're talking about here. So there's a couple sources if anybody would want to get more information on the actual act and different interpretations on how to follow it. PennDOT has a publication, I think it's Pub 639. It's the one on the left there, Transportation Impact Fees. That was done in 2007, and then PSAT's put together a manual as well, and I think that was a little more current, like around 2000 when they prepared that one. So, and then this just came out of the PennDOT publication, just to give you an idea, at least as of 2007, some of the municipalities close to Delaware County that have impact fees, there are none in Delaware County itself that I'm aware of that, no municipalities have adopted an impact fee ordinance. But the ones, so I highlighted Montgomery and Chester in blue. You can see the ones that do have it, the prices, the fees range anywhere from, just under $1,000 to maybe $2,000 to $3,000. I think at the time, the highest one here was Chester County at $3,500, East Brandywine Township. But this map here, I think, kind of sums everything up that like some of the challenges that we're talking about. So you can see that as of 2007, there were approximately 60 municipalities that had impact fees out of over 2,500 municipalities in Pennsylvania. And you can really see that, it's really apparent on the map where the yellow are the municipalities that have adopted impact fees and the blue haven't. And I think that speaks to the, some of the challenges and limitations of the act. So the process in preparing an impact fee study, first the township would, or the municipality would put together a traffic impact fee advisory committee. And that consists of anywhere from 7 to 15 people. I think it's 40% of those have to be in the real estate market, developers, those sorts of businesses, and they have to have a business within that municipality. And then the remainder of those members can be residents of the municipality. And they're really the ones that see this whole ordinance and this whole process through to the end. It's kind of like a steering committee to work through the process. So then what happens is a land use assumptions report is prepared, and that can be done by a land planner generally. And what that does is it's basically projecting the growth that's, I don't know what that is. That's projecting the growth that's supposed to occur within the municipality, usually about 10 years out. So it'll look at the zoning, available properties, and things of that sort, and try to come up with a pretty good estimate of what may occur in the future in the township. So then after that's prepared, a roadway sufficiency analysis is conducted, and that's an actual traffic study that looks at the capacity of the road network and determines what improvements are necessary to accommodate future growth. And once that's completed, a capital improvements plan is conducted, and that basically takes all those improvements that were identified in the roadway sufficiency analysis and comes up with the costs and the funding sources and a schedule. And then the ultimate conclusion of all this work really is those last two words, and that's the impact fee. And that's really what the gist of this is. You come up with a fee that can be charged to new development on a per trip basis. And this whole process up here has to be completed within 18 months from the time that the municipality says that they want to enact an impact fee. The clock starts ticking, and then they have 18 months to finalize it. And it sounds like a long time, but it takes pretty much that whole 18 months by the time you go through this entire process. And then this is just a flow chart showing a little more detail of some of this. You can see how many steps are involved. For example, the land use assumptions report, there's different meetings and drafts that have to be prepared. And then they have to go to the, at some point you're going to the planning commission or the supervisors and getting their input, and you're going back and forth between the different bodies within the municipality to make sure everyone's on board. So next I wanted to just go through an example of one that we did in West Whiteland Township, and I think you'll start to see some of the, like I said, some of the things involved in putting it together and some of the challenges. So this was a land use assumptions report that was prepared by Thurkoff. And what they did was they basically broke West Whiteland Township down. If you look on the left there, the map, that's the entire township. And all those areas in green are development areas that they broke out. They called them character areas. And then on the right side of the sheet of the slide here is all the projected growth that they're anticipating. So they have so many single-family houses, townhouses, there's office, there's warehouse, all the different types of land uses, and they came up with square footages or dwelling units or whatever the case may be. So then after that was completed, around the same time, you'll see this map's very similar to the one that was used in the land use assumptions report. We had to prepare a study area. So one of the things with the Act 209 legislation is that the study area can't exceed 7 square miles. Well, a vast majority of municipalities exceed 7 square miles. So then you have to figure out how you're going to make that work within the municipality. There's several ways you can do it. You can have multiple service areas, or another common way that we've done it in the past, and other municipalities have as well. If you look on all the areas shaded in red here, were specifically excluded from the service area. So we might take something like up in here, the upper right. This is parkland owned by the county and the township. That'll likely never be developed, or at least not in anything real intense. There might be a cemetery. Obviously, that's not going to get developed. We can exclude that. You'll see a lot of residential developments. They're not going to get redeveloped into anything significant. You might see a few houses here and there be constructed, but nothing, like I said, nothing significant. So by the time we subtract all that out, we got it down to a 7 square mile area, which is what you see in the white. And then we had to determine what intersections we want to include. And this is where you really have to get creative in preparing these types of studies. If you're familiar with West Whiteland, this is basically the Exton area, and we have Route 100 running north-south, and we have Lincoln Highway running east-west, and of course we have the Route 30 bypass. So there's a lot of traffic going through this area. And when we were first asked by the township to prepare this, we're thinking, there's too much growth that's already occurred. This might not be a good candidate. But we were able to identify at least 8, we have 8 intersections that we identified with these purple dots that we included in the study area. And I'll show you in the next slides like why they were specifically chosen. But we intentionally did not include Route 100. I mean, again, like I said, if you think about this area, the first thing that's going to come to your mind, traffic, is going to be Route 100 and Route 30. But we realized the way the act is written, those roads would basically dictate everything that we do for the entire study, and we probably would not be able to include any of these other intersections. So again, I'll explain that a little bit more. So for those of you who are not familiar with level of service, as traffic engineers, we conduct analyses at intersections using traffic counts, and then we have software available and formulas that are based on empirical data from decades of data, and we analyze it, and basically we come up with a delay for an average vehicle, and then that's converted to what's called a level of service, which is very intuitive. It's basically like your report card, with an A being the best and an F being a failing level of service. So the reason I mention that is because when we do these studies, we have to adopt a preferred level of service. In this particular case, West Whiteland chose to adopt a preferred level of service C for the overall intersection, and then each lane group had to be at least a level of service D. So we could have made that anything we wanted, but you have to keep in mind, like let's just say we said we wanted to make that a level of service A. We would have to improve, I'll get into this a little bit more too, but basically we'd have to improve every intersection to an A, which would be, probably a ridiculous amount of improvements. It just wouldn't be feasible. So after we identified that preferred level of service, we conducted the roadway sufficiency analysis, and this is the cover from that report. Again, this was in 2015. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with this, but this is the figures that we had in the report. So here we look at the existing conditions. And there's the 8 intersections shown out in all the bubbles. And all those arrows represent the turning movements for each intersection. And then the letters are the levels of service. So you can see of the 8 intersections that we chose to study, the overall levels of service are generally pretty good. They're generally a D or better, and the movements operate pretty well also. So what we have to do then is figure out what improvements need to be done in the existing condition to make all those intersections operate at those preferred levels of service. In this case, all we had to do was retime 2 traffic signals, okay? And that cost cannot be attributed to impact fees. The township basically is responsible for that. And that's why it's important when you pick your intersections. Is, for example, if we picked Route 100 and we had to make that operate at level service C, we'd probably be adding through lanes in each direction. It's already 3 through lanes. We'd be making it 8 or 10 lanes, which is it's just not feasible. And then the other way we could do it is say, well, we know that's, excuse me, that's not feasible. What if we go with, we lower the bar a little bit? What if we make the overall level of service an E or even an F with a certain delay? Well, if we do that, then again, Route 100 is dictating everything we do in the study. All those other intersections then, we would only have to make them operate at an E or an F, which basically means we would do no improvements anywhere. So again, one of the challenges that we come across with this is the preferred level of service is the same for the entire service area. You can't change it by intersection. So that's definitely a challenge that we have to deal with. And a lot of times what you end up doing in the beginning of these, we do, we'll do some preliminary analyses and do like a sensitivity analysis and see, what the sweet spot is where we want to have our preferred level of service. So then the next step is we look at the base condition, which is 10 years out. And this includes none of the future development that we would charge an impact fee for, but there are developments that the township might be aware of that are already going through land development, but maybe haven't been approved. So they're not eligible. The township can't charge them the impact fee. There's an interim fee that they could possibly charge, but not the final fee. So we include that in this base condition. Also, there's developments obviously occurring in the municipalities around West Whiteland or whatever the township is that we're studying, and that traffic's going to pass through this township. So that all gets included in base condition. So we put all that traffic in here and we analyzed it. And again, you can see those 8 intersections aren't too bad. Over here we had an E, here's a movement with an F, another movement, a couple movements with an F, but nothing too bad. So then the next step is, what does it take to fix those? And I think we ended up putting like a right turn lane over here. It's not showing up on this slide, it's a different color, but I think that was it right. And then retiming. So very minimal improvements. We were able to bring this up to preferred levels of service. These improvements can't be attributed to the impact fees. The township's got to eat the cost for all these base improvements. So you're not fixing existing problems. Basically what you're doing is just maintaining what you have and not allowing it to get any worse when development comes in. So then the next iteration of this is we look at the projected conditions. So again, we're 10 years out. We had that base condition that I talked about with all the pass-through traffic and all the other developments that we know about. And then we add in all the development that was identified in the land use assumptions report. And we analyze it. And now you can start to see some impacts. Up here we have a level service F overall. We have some individual movements with Fs. A D here overall. Some other poor levels of service scattered throughout. So that's the projected condition if we were to do nothing other than the existing and base improvements. Then we do another iteration. Now this time we figure out what improvements would be required to bring that projected condition up to the preferred level of service. And when we do that, everything that you can see now is all, pretty much level service C or better overall, with all the movements operating at least a level service D. And then if you look at the lane configurations for those intersections, all the lanes that are shown in red are basically proposed lanes in the projected condition, and these are things that we can actually charge developers for. So after that's completed, now at this point, we've identified all the improvements that are needed for the projected condition. Now we put together what's called a capital improvements plan. And that basically just comes up with costs for all those improvements. In this particular case, if you recall, the first iteration was just retiming a couple traffic signals. The municipality would have to eat this cost of $7,000. Okay, that's not a huge deal. Then for the base condition, which is 2025, with none of the development that we could charge fees for, that came out to about $4 million of improvements. Theoretically, the municipality would be responsible for that. I say theoretically because they're not really required to do any of those improvements. We just can't charge future development for those improvements. And then the last thing that we do is the 2025 projected condition, and that was about $24 million worth of improvements that we identified. In this particular case, well, let me back up. It's $24 million to do the work, but Act 209 limits the amount of money that you can charge the developer to 50% if it's on a state road. And the assumption is that you're going to find another source of funding for that other 50%. They don't identify what that source is. You're kind of left on your own, whether it be money that you have in your general fund, or if you can obtain a grant, or work out some other deal with a developer or something of that sort. So in this particular case, we said that $5 million of that would be attributable to new development, and $19 million would be funded by other sources. And we kind of did that also because the fee was going to end up being, I forget the number now, but it might have been like $5,000 to $6,000 or $7,000 per trip, which the township thought was excessive. So we were able to assume that more of that money would come from other sources instead of new development, and we were able to lower the amount then. So the total cost of all improvements was $28 million. And then this was just, I'm not going to get into all, this was just a spreadsheet that ends up going in the capital improvements plan. And basically we just list every intersection and what the improvements are and how much of that cost is for existing conditions that the township pays, the base condition that the township pays, and then how much can we charge a developer, and what are the funding sources and all that. And then you come down the bottom here, and the sum is basically that 0.02% of that was existing conditions and 14% was base. And we're able to get basically 67% of that in the projected condition that we can charge developers for those improvements. So you take those numbers, and all that work that I just talked about basically boils down to this one equation. So we figured out we have $5 million worth of improvements that we can charge developers for. All right, so that's in the numerator of this equation. And overall, all that new development generates about 4,000 trips. So you divide that total number by 4,000 and you come up with $1,219.65 per PM peak hour trip. So that means now that any new development that comes in within that service area, as long as they're not in that area that we highlighted in red, would have to pay this fee. And to put that in terms, like the one I always think of is residential development, because a single family house basically generates one trip in the PM peak hour. So an easy way to think of this is you're basically, for every house that comes in, you're charging $1,200. Okay, and that kind of puts it in perspective too. You think that that's going to get tacked on the price of a house. So this is actually a pretty low fee, I think, by today's standards. Back in 1990, if this was $1,200 when this act first came out, an average house might not have been much more than $100,000. So you're roughly like 1%. Well, now these houses are probably selling for easily over $500,000, and the fee's only $1,200. So the percentage has dropped, but I think this one's on the low end of what's happening today. I don't think it's uncommon to see $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 anymore for impact fees. But I always think of that, the way I always think of it is in terms of a residential house, how does that correlate to what that house is going to sell for? So some of the challenges, I mentioned some of them briefly, and I'll just go over them again. So obviously the legislation's complicated. That's kind of why I wanted to go through that iterative process so you can see all the work that's involved in it. This isn't just a simple study that we crank out in a couple days. It takes like pretty much the full 18 months with a lot of meetings and a lot of coordination. And they're also very expensive. I mean, these studies could easily be over $100,000. And some of that you can include in the impact fees, but not all of it. The service area is limited to 7 square miles. As you can see, you can get creative and put little donut holes here and there. Sometimes you have to do multiple service areas. That has its own set of problems because traffic that's generated in one service area might pass through the other one, and you can't charge fees for that pass-through traffic. We've encountered that. A lot of times you have an interchange that's in one service area, but all the traffic might be coming from another service area. So you're going to see a lot of impacts, but you can't do anything about it as far as impact fees go. That's a limitation. You can't fix existing deficiencies with impact fees. Basically, you're maintaining the status quo at the time of whenever you prepare the report. You're kind of saying, okay, whatever it is now, we're just going to be happy with that, or we're going to live with it, and we're just not going to make it any worse. I mean, you might see some improvements here and there. For example, if you take an unsignalized intersection and signalize it, you might have doubled or tripled the capacity, and maybe you're not going to add that much traffic to it. So overall, you might see an increase in operations, but that's really not the point of this. You're basically just making sure it doesn't get worse.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Did you say, Commissioner Smith, did you say that you cannot improve or repair existing?
That's correct.
Corridor, but you can't use money. What I'm trying to say is this: the corner of my location, California Road, they put in the wall. They didn't change the light fixtures or nothing. They did a couple of curb cuts. I don't see a real improvement except that you got a brand new building. So why is it that those street lights and stuff were not new equipment, new light devices, new everything?
In the impact fee?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's two things going. First of all, that Wawa development, if you don't have an impact fee, it really doesn't have anything to do with this. But as far as this goes, the only way you could upgrade the equipment would be if you have to widen the road and maybe the signal equipment needs to be relocated. Or maybe we would identify that coordination or some other, better technology might help.
There's some new devices, which is normal, where you can reach handicap, things like that. But it's not congruent to other communities, other developments. It's like basically, we're here, take what we give you, keep it moving. Why would you put new lights on old poles?
Right, well, that probably goes back to your signal specifications of the municipality. There's other mechanisms, I think, where you can work with developers to get those things upgraded at the time of development.
The signal company did provide the service, they did add some devices, but they didn't change the lighting system at all. So I know what they did, I'm going to address that, I'm trying to figure out, they get a better understanding. To me, it seems that someone conducts all these studies. It takes 18 months to make a study. It takes a whole lot of money to conduct these studies, and you cannot change existing with certain funds, and it's basically less of new development all the way around.
Right.
So basically, you recoup the cost. So for any elected official for 8 years, if your study's a 10-year study, it's like a waste of time, a waste of money.
That's why we're talking about these challenges. That's the whole point of this discussion. You're right.
And then I'm sorry, lastly, when the studies are conducted, who gets paid for those studies? I always hear, you gotta get a study done, you have to do a feasibility study, you have to get surveys. Well, we can clearly see what the problem is. Now let's get the correct professionals to do the land development, the layout, cut that 18 months down to 9 months, 6 months. It takes too long for a process. then you pay too much money. So it seems like you know what we're talking about. Somebody's getting paid to do nothing.
Right, well, so again, there's two different things going on here. The 18 months I'm referring to was for a very specific study. That's to give the municipality the ability to charge an impact fee. So when a developer comes in, and you say you generate 100 trips, we have a trip generation manual. We have all the different land uses in there, and we go in there and we can generate traffic based on whatever the land use is. And it'll say, let's just say it's 100 trips. In this particular case, we'd multiply the 100 times that $1,200 per trip, and so they would owe like $120,000 for that development. And that money could go to the improvements, only to the improvements that were identified in here. You can't use that for anything else. Okay, now that's that, but I think what you're talking about is a whole other thing. That's just the land development coming in where you're relying on your standard subdivision land development ordinances and zoning and whatever policies you have in place, as far as traffic signal equipment. For example, some municipalities want decorative or ornamental poles. They might want them painted black or green or something like that. That's in that document. That's how they can make them do that.
But being on the state highway, north, east, and south, and you develop, which is private property, and they're going to build it in one build. But it seems like that the state or the license for black patrollers, that company didn't do the best what they should have done. So we're going to revisit it, and it's just not the want to other communities. They can claim that this low-income community is really not. We got a lot of money being generated in our community, but we're not seeing the revenues, and then that money is not being used for betterment in that area. So you got $120,000 coming in. What did you use it on? I don't want to hear about trees and shrubs. You're not doing enough with the money that we came in, except for paying engineers and assistant engineers. You know what I'm saying? I want some good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So the last item on here that I have so far is you can't use this money, these fees, to address pass-through traffic. So the municipality adjacent to you might be putting in a huge development, and all that traffic's going to cut through your municipality. You can't charge that developer impact fee money, impact fees for that project. Now there are some exceptions to that. The legislation was updated, I think it was in 2000 with Act 68, and municipalities can work together and prepare a joint study, but Nicole, I'm not aware of any that have a joint study.
I don't believe any municipalities have taken that approach.
Right. Because again, it's this whole cumbersome process you have to go through, and they have to really be willing to work together. As I mentioned earlier, you have to pick one service, preferred level of service for an entire service area. As I gave you that example with the Route 100 corridor, one size does not fit all. We were able to, kind of pick intersections that were going to be impacted, and we were able to make it work. And then the other thing that really worked out in West Whiteland was, Route 100 really is a regional road, regional highway. And I don't think anybody thought that it would be within West Whiteland's ability to improve that road without, getting PennDOT and public funds involved and all that. It was just way too big for the municipality to handle. So we just kind of put that road aside and said that's like a regional thing. We're not going to get an impact fees for that. So the study's also limited to one peak hour. Generally, we study the PM peak hour, which would occur between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. That's usually the worst case scenario. But a lot of times, and particularly in Delaware County, I think, a lot of people work in the city. So you might see all that traffic heading in one direction going into the city in the morning. And then they all come home in the afternoon. Well, all we're looking at is that afternoon when they're all coming, westbound or whatever. So we come up with our improvements based on that. There's really no ability within this legislation to use common sense, I'll say, and obviously, common sense is going to tell you that if you put a through lane in the eastbound direction for the PM, you're going to need it in the westbound direction in the AM, or vice versa. So you really can't do much about that. Fees can only be spent on improvements that were identified in a roadway sufficiency analysis. And that also limits your ability to negotiate with developers. So, there have been cases where a development might come in, they have an impact somewhere, they're willing to do an improvement. It might even fix an existing problem that you have. In some limited cases, you might be able to work with that developer. But generally, if you're going by the book here, if it's not listed in the roadway sufficiency analysis, you can't use those fees for those improvements. So in some cases, you're almost like double dipping. You're making the developer pay an impact fee, and then they might also have to do other improvements. Safety improvements, and like road widening, if you want to add shoulders or things like that. Equipment upgrades, like you mentioned about the signal equipment. Maybe you have a bridge replacement, just general maintenance, overlaying a road or fixing potholes, things like that. Drainage improvements, none of that stuff can be funded with these impact fees. It's only for those improvements that were identified in the roadway sufficiency analysis. You also can't use the fees for things like pedestrian facilities, bicycle lanes or trails, or mass transit improvements. This is really a vehicular capacity plan that this legislation addresses, and it doesn't really get into all those other modes of transportation. And as I mentioned earlier, fees can only cover up to 50% of the cost for the improvements on a state road. If you have township roads or municipal roads, you can fund 100%, but there's not many instances where we have a township road intersecting a township road and it has enough traffic to the level that we need to study it in here. Generally, there's a state road involved somewhere if it's going to be included in this study. So right off the bat, you're kind of admitting that you're 50% short of what you need to complete the improvement, and you're going to need to work hard to find funding sources to cover that gap. And then because of some of these things that I just mentioned above, a lot of municipalities will collect the fees, and they might have difficulty figuring out how to spend that money. So unfortunately, a lot of that money is just sitting unused in bank accounts until they figure out how to go about spending the money. What we try to do, but this doesn't always work out, is best case scenario would be you get a developer to do the improvement for you, and then they can get a credit towards that fee. So they could probably do it cheaper than the municipality can. They could do it quicker, and then you don't have to get into like all the accounting things that go along with holding on to the fees and spending them and all that. But if you can't come up with an improvement, or you can't work it out somehow where the developer does it, you just collect the fee, it goes in the pot, and then at some point that money can be used to start implementing these improvements. But that, like I said, that is very challenging for a lot of municipalities. And that's all I have. I don't know, Nicole, if you...
Thanks, Jerry. I'll just add a couple things and then we'll open it up for more questions and discussion. But kind of, focusing in on some of the challenges. I think Jerry talked about, and the latest information is that there's 60 or 61 municipalities in Pennsylvania that have enacted, Act 209 legislation and impact fee ordinances from that. And I was taking a look at our records. We've done 30 of them, and I expect Jerry and his firm has probably done the other 30. So you do have the experience here in the room that hopefully we can have some good dialogue and answer some of your questions. But Jerry did a great job of kind of laying it out and demonstrating that there are a lot of rules and regulations within the legislation. There is also a lot of gray area, which which can be a good thing, but also in some cases is not a good thing because there's too much ambiguity and it's not clear, maybe to a municipality, how they would, best utilize, the impact fees that they would collect after going through this process. But I would categorize our success stories into, two different and very distinct categories. One, Jerry mentioned in his challenges, is the municipalities that are in a position to be able to negotiate with the developers to get improvements done by the developer on their dime at a cheaper rate, and then give them credits on impact fees. So the municipality ends up collecting very little or no fees at all. They don't have to worry about money sitting in a bank account, but they're using it as leverage to negotiate with their developers. The other success story is really those municipalities that got ahead of their development pressure and enacted Act 209 legislation, at the beginning of their boom. And so they've been able to collect a significant amount of money. And even though they're only able to collect a percentage of each intersection improvement, they've been able to collect enough fees and totals that they've been able to, on their own, do the highest priority projects in their capital improvement program. So because you're only able to collect a percentage, you're not collecting the total fees across the entire service area, but if you have enough developments come in and you collect enough money, you can focus all that money on one or two or three of your key priority intersections and get some really nice projects done. So those are kind of two very different success stories. But all the challenges that Jerry mentioned, if you're a municipality, and I believe this is one of the reasons that Act 209 really doesn't work for Delaware County, if you're already in a much more populated, densely developed area, and you're not able to collect enough fees to get projects done, then why would you go through the process of paying for what is a relatively expensive process and be very limited on the types of improvements you can do and very limited on the amount of fees you can collect, and therefore you have money sitting in a bank account that just isn't enough to do any of your projects. And the lack, leads into, the lack of ability to do anything other than really intersection capacity increasing type projects. The multimodal aspects and the transit aspects are critical to the transportation network, but this act does not speak to that in any way. So that's a couple, additional notes and things to think about, but we're happy to take your questions, and I think Joe's going to kind of help us facilitate that.
Sure. This would be similar to a panel discussion. If anybody has any questions, I guess I could either come around with the microphone or you can shout them out. No? Leave the microphone here. Mark?
Excuse me, two questions. First of all, what is the prospect of there being any changes to the act? And then secondly, some of the early adopters have gone through their 10 years of their land use assumptions reports, and I'm curious as to whether anybody's taken a look back to see in some of these municipalities whether they hit the mark, missed the mark, and subsequently do they have the opportunity to go back and revisit assumptions and make adjustments, which then would drive adjustments to the fees?
So your second question I'll hit first because I think it's a good point to note. So we enacted Act 209 for some very early adopters. And as part of the act, the municipality is required to update it on a regular basis. So we are now into 2 or 3 updates in some of those early adopter municipalities. At a minimum, you have to update the fees for current dollars. But there is a trigger that you need to do a more global look at it. And particularly if you've had a lot of developments come in, then you want to relook at your land use assumptions report. Maybe there has been zoning changes that you would want to account for, things of that nature. And that is really an opportunity to look at, okay, how much have we collected? Where did we think we would be at this stage, in the game? And I would say, in our experience, we've had a mix of success stories and maybe not as successful as the municipality was hoping for. And in terms of our understanding, I think at this point of the legislation is that there are people in the Transportation Committee at the state level that are interested in making changes to the legislation to address some of these shortfalls and maybe fill in some of the holes. How much momentum does it have, within the global, political environment? I don't know. Certainly see if Jerry has any information on that. But we do understand that there was a white paper prepared at the legislative level, so there is some interest. But on a broader scale, I don't know how much support it has at this point.
I don't really have much more to add to the legislation. I just really don't know. I mean, I guess it literally takes an act of Congress to change it. So who knows how long that's going to take if it happens. But going back to talking about how effective some of these studies were, that example I showed for West Whiteland was, we were really pleased with the way that all came together. We happened to have a developer come in just after that project or that study was completed, who was willing to do a lot of those improvements. It has to do, it's on Ship Road, Ship and Route 100 in West Whiteland. There was or there is an historic inn, the Ship Inn right there, and a chapel that's historic. And we basically had to take the road and split it and go around these historic buildings with one way in each direction, and kind of thinking outside the box. And the developer was fine with it, and he decided to construct these improvements as part of his project. And as a result, I think we've done almost every improvement in that study, other than there might be like 2 or 3 intersections down on the western side of the intersection, which honestly aren't as bad as some of the ones that are being fixed right now. So I thought that, it really worked out well. I think the timing was just right. The right developer came in. There was probably the right staff at the township at the time, where it all just fell in place. That's not always the case. There's other municipalities who probably haven't, really done anything with their money. And it's just sitting there from 20 years ago. So it's a mix.
So you mentioned there are a lot of push restrictions for what municipalities can use their fee revenue on. Fully understand. In the event that the municipality waives the fee in favor of the developer doing improvements, those improvements done by the developer subject to the same restrictions, or are they able to make safety improvements and other improvements?
So if the township is able, or municipality is able to negotiate with the developer and they aren't really physically using the Act 209 impact fees, they aren't collecting the money, then none of the legislation guidelines apply. They have, full reign to negotiate with the developer, and they don't have those ties. And, that was what I mentioned. One of the kind of categories for success is spending the money to implement Act 209 if you feel like it gives you better leverage and is worth that investment, even though your intention may to be, we don't want to collect fees. We would only collect the fees if we can't reach a reasonable, negotiation and compromise with the developer that we would be happy with. We would always be able to just say, well, then just pay the fees and we'll move on. But if you can, have that successful negotiation, and this legislation and enacting it helps you get there, then those ties do not apply unless you are actually collecting the fees and following the process.
Question.
1 second.
No, I just wanted to add to that a little bit. I totally agree with that. The only thing I would caution is that it may not apply to every situation. You can't just start waiving fees just because you want to, negotiate something different. Generally, when that's done, either the development's in the best interest of the municipality. That definition is kind of vague, whatever you think's in the best interest. But in some cases, if the majority of your township showing up against the project, it might be kind of hard to say it's in the best interest. So that argument sort of goes out the window. But other cases where you can do it too is, I've seen instances where, maybe an intersection was calling for additional through lanes or left turn lanes, and this developer just happened to be willing to put a connector road through their site, where traffic could then bypass an intersection. Therefore, those improvements are no longer needed, and what they're doing is, equally as effective. In those cases, those fees can be waived. So yeah, that can happen, but I would just caution that you need to be careful that you don't set a precedent and open yourself up to challenges from future developers.
I'll come back to you in 1 second. I think I had one other question over here. Please.
Actually, do you find that any town or borough that's initiated the 209, do you find that deterred some buffer from knowing that they have that? And then just a quick follow-up, you can answer the question, is if there's an improvement portion that is identified in 209, but let's say a bike trail comes through in the 5 years since, in that is now triggered that has to be upgraded with the safety rule, if they lane capacity has to be added. Can that then be put into 209, or does that then fall on the township or municipality to upgrade?
So the first question Jerry and I were actually talking about earlier today, sharing some examples. We have an example of a municipality that we did their first Act 209 study. They had 2 service areas, and Route 422, non-expressway section of 422 traverses through one of the service areas. And with all the development pressure that was assumed in the land use assumptions report, widening was going to be needed for extra capacity along several of the 422 intersections. And as a result, the fee was going to be $4,000 or $5,000 per peak hour trip. We cautioned them. It depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to deter a certain amount of development, then a higher fee is more likely to do that. And that might be the goal of some municipalities, and they might want to use Act 209 for that. Not really the intent, but it does have that effect. But in Jerry's West Whiteland example, they looked at a little bit of a different split of the responsibility from other sources to be able to impact ultimately what their final fee was, because they wanted to find that right balance. So it really depends on the municipality's approach, but in my example of the 422 corridor having a $4,000 to $5,000 per trip impact fee, they implemented that, and 3 years later they came back and revised it because they found that they completely scared away all of their development on that corridor, and that was not their goal. Even though we cautioned them, they still proceeded, but they found that what we were telling them was true, and they simply came back and made some adjustments, and they brought that fee down. So that absolutely happens. In terms of your question on the example with the bike lane, I would just say that it has to be a capacity improvement that is tied to the projected with development preferred level of service. If it meets those checks on the list, then yes, it can be included in the impact fee. If it can't check all those boxes, it cannot be. And that's an example of where it's difficult to check those boxes, even though it makes sense. And even from a logical standpoint, it makes sense that at least some of that should be on the developments. In terms of their responsibility, sometimes it's still hard to check all those boxes, and that's where the legislation can kind of tie your hands, that if you can't show that, then you can't include it in the impact fee. So